here on Village in Motion, and Jane Curtis has dug up another little interesting fact in some American history that you may find a little different. So welcome, Jane.
Good morning. No, this is a tidbit. It's a little thing in terms of great wars, large wars, but a lot of action went into this little war.
Right.
This was the Barbary Wars. Well, actually, really was only one, 1801 to 1805. And there was a little reverberation later, which was instantly squashed. But this war was actually the first foreign war we ever had in our country. Took place, as I say, between 1801 and 1805.
Okay.
And what was going on here at that point? Well, at that point, George Washington was not long dead. He had died in 1799. John Adams had been president, and he gave way then to Jefferson, who became president. And we had the Federalist Party, and we had a Liberal Party that went by some different names. And we didn't have a Navy as yet. George Washington had been a pacifist, and he thought, we're not going to have a standing army, we're not going to have a standing Navy, because we want to be neutral and just keep out of things and do our own thing. But what began to happen principally in the Mediterranean, we're going to see pretty soon some pictures for these things. Principally in the Mediterranean, pirate ships began to attack merchant shipping. Now, some of the European powers paid off the powers there that were doing this, the countries there that were doing it. But the United States had ridden along. We were not yet the United States. We had ridden along under the British payment, so we were not too much bothered, nor did we have an awful lot of shipping there at that time.
But we did have merchant ships, right?
We had merchant shipping, that's right. Mm-hmm. But it came to the point where we were being seriously attacked, and our people, what these pirates did, they came from the countries along the north coast of Africa,
okay,
the Mediterranean coast. And they were Morocco on the west, and then Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, which as we now know as Libya, that area. Mm-hmm. But what they would do, Gibraltar was a sort of bottleneck. Ships had to go through there, enter the Mediterranean, and there's nowhere to run. And the channel stayed fairly narrow until it broadened out. So it was perfect territory to attack anybody who was in there, which the pirates did from quite early on in history. I know in the 1500s there was a great lot of corsair and pirate going on.
Yes.
The Ottoman Empire had taken over in that area at that time. But as far as our present story goes here about this war, it was things like the capture of a ship in 1785. This was only 2 years after the Revolution.
Right.
And of course the pirates knew we were no longer under British cover. So only 2 years later, our ships began to be taken, merchant ships. And what happened when they were captured, these pirates would come up. They were rarely stronger than the ship they attacked, but they'd come up under some peaceful guise and then boarded. And you see all these wild pictures, brigands with knives in their teeth and all that, jumping aboard. But they did at any rate, and it wasn't funny. They took the cargo for themselves, or they handed it over to the boss of the local area, whatever. Mm-hmm. They used another, took everything, even took the uniforms off later on, off the military ones. But they took everything, and later on they began to just take the ship as well, to sort of refit it. Then they had bigger ships, you see.
Right.
But in 1785, an American merchant ship was cruising just off the Spanish-Portuguese coast in the Atlantic, and a ship approached, and it looked harmless, but it wasn't, because when it came up next to them, it was Algerian pirates. They seized the ship, they seized the crew, the officers got slightly better treatment, but not much. The crew was put to slavery labor. They were made slaves. Mm-hmm. All of them were slaves, actually, in one form or another. And they were taken back to Algiers, and the ship, of course, was going to be taken and used. And this was just one of many. This was a big example, but the United States government began to be, we were not yet the United States. I shouldn't say the United States government, but our government anyway did. Now the Continentals had ships during the Revolutionary War, but we really didn't have a navy.
Right.
And as I say, Washington didn't want it. But this was a subject of some pain for our country, because what can you do about it? Well, George Washington sent a consul out, and things kind of rode by themselves for a couple of years, getting worse and worse. Finally, they agreed, the United States, in Congress, after 1789, we better pay up. So they started paying tribute. And in 1 year alone, I think it was 1797, they paid $125 million
Wow.
to these 4 countries that were doing the
at
marauding,
that time.
under the blessing of the Ottoman Empire, which was still there. I think Morocco was more or less independent, and they were the first to recognize our country, which they did in 1777. But that didn't stop them from continuing their activities there. So toward the end of the 1790s, then we decided that we'd better have a navy. And before Washington died, he had more or less agreed, all right, we better do something about this. And he did not put the kibosh on building a couple of military ships, which was done. As 1800 dawned, of course, we moved our capital up from Philadelphia to Washington. A lot was going on in the world. Napoleon was a big threat. He had been in the 1790s. In fact, he got down there in that area, Egypt area, but he had warships. And they were, the pirates were a little bit leery of attacking them. But in our country, the Federalist Party, John Adams was head of it, and after Washington was out of office, after 1797, he said, no, the famous quotation from him was, millions for defense, but not 1 penny for tribute. No, we won't pay. And Thomas Jefferson, who was his political enemy and was soon to become president, was basically conservative, but he said, we better do something about this. So they let the ship production continue. Ship production continued. We were able to put up a defense. And there followed then, in these next 3-4 years, treaties, broken treaties, some more ship captures, a lot of capture from our side it began to happen.
Oh.
The situation really hadn't gotten very much better. But in the middle of this, I think it was 1803, the Tripoli side of it declared war on the United States. And this was a sort of comic opera thing, because what they did was go and try to chop down the flagpole in front of the U.S. consulate. The Americans had set consuls to each of those areas.
Okay.
Morocco was a sultanate and it was a little bit different, but the other 3, the words Dey, D-E-Y, Bey, B-E-Y, and Bashaw, or Pasha, were the 3 names of the rulers, and I understand they were pretty well interchangeable because they were all under the Turks. They were sort of a zone of influence of the Ottoman Turks. But here were consuls going to these places. And again, later we'll get a little flavor of what that looked like. But we had our consuls there, and they were powerless to do anything about this. In Algiers, for instance, here you had all these people in captivity, and there was a reporter sketch of a chain gang of them, and they were out in the mountains, breaking stone. And of course, the others were, the officers were a little better, but their uniforms were stolen. They were wearing rags. They slept on stone floors. They just as little was keeping them alive was all they were getting to eat. So the situation was pretty terrible. Well, some of our people who were sent there, and we'll say a little more about this when we look at a few pictures of them, but they began to try a little harder to get a treaty going that would last, that would hold, that would do something. But it was really when the warships came up that
We began to be a
we
threat
began
to them.
to make them realize that we meant business. We had several different Commodore. Commodore was a rank that doesn't exist anymore, but the captains of the ships, many of them became Commodores, and the Commodore was usually the leader of a little group of ships.
Right.
And the basic strategy was going to be a rendezvous at Gibraltar, and then some of the ships are going to go out and establish a blockade for Tripoli, and the others were going to hang around there and try to keep the pirates in check in the meantime. But anytime an American warship got out in the water, they were empowered to attack the other and put it out of business. The others had captured really, I think, only one big one of ours that they were adapting to their own use. Otherwise, they were small craft. And again, we'll have a quick look at some of these. Now, I think we'll go to these pictures because these will show you a lot, and we'll run through them rather quickly. But let's begin, please, with the map. The map will show us the Mediterranean Ocean, and Mediterranean Sea, I should say. And you can see all the green is the Ottoman Empire. This is the area where the Turks still had sway. And you can see over on the left, there's Morocco. The green reflects pretty well, except the whole country usually wasn't involved. And there wasn't much behind the sea coast areas because it was desert. And that was another problem, because when these captives were kept in the desert, it was pretty bad torture, and you couldn't even think of escaping for something like that. But you see, we had Algiers, and then Tunis, and that little headland there, that was where Tunis was, and then Tripoli went off, extended off to the east, and between Tripoli, now called Libya, and the Egyptian border was the extent of that. And again, it was borders, it was desert involved, and I don't think there was any drawn border to that, which didn't matter. The next picture is another view of it, and you can see roughly that purplish area is the area where the pirates were the most active. They also extended slightly down the coast of Africa, if any shipping appeared down there. And they must have had a pretty good information service to get themselves to know about it. But others went as far as Europe. There were raids, coastal raids, sometimes as far as Holland, and at least one ship even got to Iceland. But basically, this is the area. And it's the very area that you would be in if you were a merchant ship, because you see it went around. It went under Sicily, and there's Malta down there, the base, and then off toward Greece. And of course, meanwhile, the whole western basin gave them access to the shores, coastal raiding. They really, really had it covered. Next shot, please. This is a picture showing, called the Negotiators. John Adams on the left, Thomas Jefferson on the right. They did try to do some negotiating. There was a treaty with Morocco, which they really didn't keep particularly, but then they were not right at the heart of the action, so they weren't as bad as Algiers and particularly Tripoli were. Next picture. This is William Eaton. Eaton, you see, is not wearing a military uniform, but he was appointed consul in Algiers, and he was sort of overview of the consuls in Tunis and in Tripoli. And he tried very hard to get the captives released and to arrange treaties and so on. He later played an important role in ending that war, because the Bashaw of Tripoli was illegal. He had murdered his oldest brother and banished the next brother in line and taken the throne. So this second brother, Eaton got hold of the second brother and was trying then to work at it that way, and that played a role in the final peace. Our next picture will show us another important person. This was Tobias Lear. Tobias Lear kind of rode in on George Washington's tails he had influence because of that and the Jefferson family. He married, I believe it was a daughter of Martha Washington, or granddaughter or something. So he looks like kind of a wheeler dealer, and he was. He was the sort of person that was being sent out for career reasons, I think, primarily, on his part. And he later on seriously impeded negotiations. But he was there for a time. Next picture, we'll get into the military. This is Bainbridge. Bainbridge was captured at one point, his ship captured, and he enslaved. He put into slavery. He eventually got out. A number of them were released in 1797, I believe it was. I know the poor one that was taken off Portugal was, but a lot of them were gotten out then by treaties, which were sometimes kept and sometimes really not honored very much. But Bainbridge played an important role, and you can see his Navy uniform. They were very elaborate in those days. The next shot shows us someone else who was important here. Or no, in the fighting. I stuck this in, how do we know what it was like? How do the movies know, for instance, when they make all these fighting on the decks and boarding ships and so on? How do they know? Well, they know because there were people went along, artists, and there were actually newspapers and things in those days. Adventurers went along, and one of them even climbed to the top rigging and sketched the deck action from above. So what we see here, if you look closely, you can see this is a boarding operation. The two ships are very close together, and there's a pirate on the right, holding a scimitar, and here's a Navy officer on the left. Now this is another one, and if we can we bring that up a little bit? Maybe not. Sometimes these things will get bigger or not, but you can see there's an officer, American officer there in his dark uniform, and he's lying on top of a Berber who is holding a knife, and our officer has a pistol, which is got at the throat of the other one, but close action. Nothing like people in action nowadays. Just totally different type of warfare. Very
much
physical.
hand to hand. Yeah.
Now, another example of fighting, this was the first time the U.S. Marines went abroad. The U.S. Marines were newly formed, but also, of course, were cultivating a reputation as being really, call the Marines and we'll fix it for you. But you can see one is uniform there. This was later in the campaign where a walk was made from Alexandria in Egypt. They walked across the desert, this little force, under Eaton, that we looked at a minute ago, former consul. They walked across there on a road near the sea, but still a desert road. And there is a military force. He was going to attack Derna, take Derna, and that would enable him then to reduce Tripoli. But you can see the very varied uniforms and varied things in here. The force was made up of different numbers. The accounts give different numbers, but there were at least 10 Marines there under a lieutenant. May we keep that a minute longer? Under Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon. And Presley O'Bannon was a Marine in fancy uniform. We'll look at him a little later too. But the Marines, he was in charge of it, of course. And they had a big Arab contingent, local Arabs that would join on and then leave if they felt like it. Mm-hmm. And there were some Greek mercenaries, so it was a mixed force. And they had a horrible time going across the desert. How do we know a lot of this? We know a lot of it, and the fighting and everything, and the ship captures, because people wrote letters, which came late but were there, and wrote reports. The archives of the Navy and the Marines and the U.S. government, consular service, foreign service. So another picture here now. We'll proceed with looking at Stephen Decatur. He is probably one of the most famous names of the period. I think most people, if they've heard of anybody from any of the officers then, Decatur made quite a name for himself as a naval officer. And he was a junior officer at the beginning. He was not captured, luckily, but his uniform and the fancy uniforms appealed to the pirates, and when they'd capture a ship, they would take it.
Take
and
the
the hat,
uniforms,
the fancy, the three-cornered hats and all. Next picture is another. Now here is Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, the Marine lieutenant, and look at that uniform. And there's an earlier sketch that I saw in black and white, but somebody actually enlivened the sketch with, I take this as his correct uniform of the day, but he was, of course they could stick pistols in those, I think those belts served double purpose, but behind him you see the American flag. And the earliest, the shores of Tripoli, got into the song because of this campaign. This is Preble, Commodore Preble, who was certainly one of the best of our officers. He fought very well in the blockading of Tripoli. Unfortunately, they said it was a rotation, a military rotation. He was sent home and replaced, which was too bad because he had done the lion's share of the work for capturing ships and for establishing a blockade. Another picture shows us one of the local people. Now this is the Bashaw of Tripoli. And it's the best picture I could find anywhere, but this is this Bashaw who was really a tough one to deal with because, as I say, he murdered his oldest brother, he banished his second brother, and he took over as ruler in Tripoli. And it was not popular with anybody, but he was raiding all over the place and demanding atrocious ransoms for the impossible ransoms. It became so impossible, it was one of the reasons why we really zeroed down on ending that war, come what may. So now the one from Algiers, the Day of Algiers, let's see the next picture. This is spelled D-E-Y. Oh no, this is Tunis, sorry. This is the Bey, B-E-Y, of Tunis, and you see he's holding court. Sometimes they begin to adopt the Western clothing. Mm-hmm. These were no longer poor pirates wearing their burnouses and all that, but people bowing to him, and their courts were very fancy. This is the Day, D-E-Y, the Day of Algiers, who was really nasty, breaking agreements. He'd say, I demand a payment of $21,000. You see some money bags there. I demand a payment of $21,000. They'd bring him $21,000, or maybe he wouldn't have received it yet. They'd say, no, the price has gone up. It's $50 if you want this. So he was terrible to agree with. And this is in a lot of the diplomatic correspondence. So this was aggravating us terribly. And meanwhile, in the background, of course, he's holding all these prisoners, many of whom were dying of exposure and overwork, exhaustion. Mm-hmm. And if any bug got in there, any disease, of course, it just wiped them out.
Oh, yeah.
This is an example of one of the ships. Now, this is a smaller one. This is the Uss Intrepid. And Intrepid, you can see it's a one-deck gunship. And you see the little gun ports along the side there. And one in the middle, there's a little yellow thing coming. The one in the middle is firing. So that was a little gunship, and it wouldn't have had more than 10 guns. It would have it on each side, but also sail. And you can, when you get up close to that with a magnifying glass, you can actually read Enterprise, not Intrepid, Enterprise in the end there. Now we're going to have 3 pictures about one of the famous ships of the fleet, which was the Philadelphia. And it was built at a time when Philadelphia was still the capital, but about to give way to Washington. Now, this is the way you build ships. On the right there, you can see the hull of the Philadelphia under construction. And again, if you look at this picture up really close, this is rickety. This is just nothing but planks laid over these uprights. And you don't really see what's holding them up. And then people carrying the heavy things going up and down to the end of that. So this is the Philadelphia under construction in about 1800. Here's the Philadelphia under full sail. This was what the ship looked like. You can see this had 2 gun decks. It was a much more powerful, it was one of our more powerful warships. Unfortunately, at one point, it ran aground on a reef, an uncharted reef, be it said, the defense of the captain, but just off Tripoli, the city, the Tripoli. And they did everything. No, not yet, not yet. Please go back, to that one. They started throwing things off the ship to make it lighter, including guns. Must have been, but you can see the deck is tilted, so if they could push the guns there, they could get them off. But it did not float the ship. He was finally forced to surrender, and you can see the small boat here, again with the crew, some of the crew aboard. And some boats still had oars and could row, and the galleys. There's another one of their small boats there, but they had to give way. And after they surrendered, of course, the tide came up and floated the ship, and the Tripoli folks got hold of the ship and towed it into harbor, and they were going to just fix it. It needed fixing. There an exchange of fire in between, and one or more of the masts had been shot off. But a daring raid by Stephen Decatur, whose picture we've just seen a moment ago, led a little band of people in a small boat here, and they boarded it, and they were able to sneak up at night, and they boarded it and set it on fire. And it completely, this is the beginning of the fire, not quite yet, this is another one. It destroyed
coming down to the end now.
It made it impossible to use anything. Yeah, all right, so the next one is the first ship, the first American, United States ship. This was a little Constellation. Again, a little sailing ship, little one round of guns.
Okay, we only have a couple,
the most famous of all,
just a couple of more minutes.
The Constitution is the most famous one of all American ships, I think. The Constitution played a big role in the action. So now you've seen a little bit, quick look at some of the people involved in their elegant uniforms, a couple of wheeler and dealers. You've seen the elegant courts, some of these, the pirate kings, the pirate rulers of the areas had. And of course, the Turks were profiting by this. Poor Bainbridge, in fact, when he first arrived on duty, he not only could placate the Dey of Algiers, but this Algerian leader actually confiscated the ship and made him sail clear to Constantinople. He himself was paying tribute to the Suleiman, who was ruling the Ottoman Empire. So it was a somewhat confused picture, but clear in the broad outline. Our first war, in a war that we finally won, it took a lot of wheeling and dealing. We learned a lot from that war, and it wasn't just when you pull into a harbor, don't get in a place where you can't get out fast, right. But it was diplomatically a great deal.
Okay, we need to wrap up here, so let's take a look and see. And remember that pirates were actual people. They were not, it's not a fairy tale.